The Western understanding of Russia is wrong, and we have to be honest about it. Recent surveys show that Western countries view Russia as mostly unfavorable, but there are still huge misconceptions about what Russia is. Many in the West romanticize Russia because it's so big and because of Russian literature and art, but that's not the real Russia. And when I say being honest, what does an average citizen in the West know about Russia? Vodka, beers and borscht. Borscht is Ukrainian, and by the way, vodka is Polish, and bears are from all over the place. So the main question is, what is Russia? Or what kind of a country is Russia? The issue is crucial because right now we hear from every corner that we need to stop the war in Ukraine, especially since Trump became the president of the United States. This would mean that direct negotiations with Putin are necessary. Hello my friends, my name is Artur Rehi and I'm from Estonia. These videos are possible thanks to monthly members of Buy Me a Coffee, and to show my gratitude I'm going to now very quickly butcher their names with my Estonian pronunciation. Ear bleeding will happen. Jochen Miva, Scott P. Eng, Fukpo Din, Sentinel Sam, Real Character. Thank you to these 5 people, and if you like these videos, become a monthly member, links in the description below. Recent poll by the Pew Research Center indicates a notable shift in American perceptions of Russia. The survey found that 11% of participants expressed a favorable view of Russia. This marks an increase of 4 percentage points from the previous year's figure of 7%. This is shocking, or maybe not so shocking. The funny part is, Russian media is publicly stating almost daily that USA is the enemy of Russian people, and for some reason this makes the United States people like Russia more. What? How? Do Americans like being called an enemy? So, to understand what Russia is, we need to see how Russian people think and where they get their information from. You see, when Putin came to power, the first thing he did was destroy independent or opposition media in the country. In 2001, the Russian government started raiding TV companies. For instance, investigators accompanied by gun-toting policemen searched the offices of the media most holding company in Moscow. The group's television station and print media have been critical for President Vladimir Putin's government. The outlet also covered how major Russian bank, Vneshekonombank, had seized NTV property. Basically, it puts the largest media outlet under government control. One of the founders of NTV, Igor Malashenko, said that this was a punishment for publication on corruption in the highest echelons of the government. By the way, the man Igor Malashenko was found dead in Spain in 2019, allegedly taking his own life. Also, flying down from windows has recently been very popular among Russian businessmen and the military. Rumors say some of them even flew better than the Russian Lancet drone. Wow. Anyways, the media situation was severed after Putin waged a full-scale war against Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. Not only are there no opposition TV outlets in Russia physically, but Putin's government has done everything to also control the internet. The Russian government has censored Western social media sites such as Facebook and many other websites. They, of course, claim it is to protect their digital space from outside influences. However, it's not a secret that if you don't trust media, you choose to watch social media. But the Kremlin, as mentioned, has restricted all Western social media. Now, Russian citizens have no access to alternative points of view. And you would probably ask, but how about YouTube? Well, unfortunately, the Kremlin's tentacles have reached this platform as well. Different experts say that YouTube's traffic in Russia has plummeted to just 20% of its normal levels in recent months. Google's monitoring service currently shows 8.5 traffic points from Russia. Before the slowdown, it was 40 points. This means it's now at roughly 20% of normal levels. So you can watch YouTube in Russia, but you gotta watch it in potato quality, the lowest of the low quality. I don't know how much can you endure that. But now we have reached the most interesting part. What do Russians watch? This is crucial because it shapes their opinions on such vital issues as the war in Ukraine. There is an article in The Atlantic called "I Watched Russian Television for 5 days Straight" by Gary Steingart. It's kind of an experiment by journalists to watch only Russian channels to understand what the average Russian viewer gets every single day. And the article says, and now I quote, it's a long quote, bear with me, "The first thing you notice when you switch on Russian TV is its totemic fascination with the swastika, which regularly appears on one of my screens. Sometimes it is taken from footage of the Nazi era, sometimes from purported videos of the Ukrainian far right, sometimes it is on the news, sometimes in a documentary, sometimes in a TV drama. By the third or fourth swastika of the day, I started to believe that when the symbol is shown this often, it is not done so entirely with disparagement, but with a subconscious appeal to the authoritarian power and to the state's own fascism." End of quote. This is true, because the most viewed Russian TV shows are full of such material. Full-mode imperialist calls are very rampant. Let's take a look at the most recent one. Solovyev, one of the most famous Russian propagandists, says that Russia will conquer Britain, France and Germany. To be more convincing, he was holding a plaque from the Kurakhove city administration from Ukraine, which Russians recently occupied. He said, and I quote, "We will bring such plaques from Berlin, Bonn and Paris. What should stop us from destroying our enemies?" End of quote. Well, Ukrainians certainly, but Solovyev is in denial as always. I mean, what do you expect from a man who lost a luxury villa in Italy? Damn it. Even with all my paychecks from the CIA, I still cannot afford a luxury villa in Italy. Sad Estonian noises. I mean, just imagine any TV show in the West saying things like this. Also, Russian politicians do not even hide their intentions. For instance, Russian State Duma members frequently say that other European countries are next in line. Duma member Alexei Zuravlev said in one such TV show, and I quote, "Ukraine is finished, so what's next? Sweden is getting ready, and so are the Baltics. The Poles have quieted down a bit, they probably started to realize that they are next." End of quote. Hey, if I was a Russian Duma member, I wouldn't mess with the Poles, I wouldn't call them out, I wouldn't want them my enemy ever. The Poles are not to be messed with. But this is exactly where the vodka kicks in. I mean, there are levels of Russian drunk rambling, and on the top is, "We will take over every country in the world," drunk. So in the West you might get the drunken level of, "Oh, everybody's my best friend, oh, I miss you so much, you're my best." In Russia it's like, "Oh, we're gonna take over everybody." So for a Russian person, having watched such content 24/7, nobody in the West should expect that Russians could be understood. In fact, the average Russian is so different from the average citizen in the West that it's like talking to a different species. How on earth can we expect that what Russians think of peace is the same thing that we in the West think of what peace is? Already in 2019, Russian lawmakers and politicians were feeding the Russian public the Orwellian notions of war and peace. Yelena Mizulina, a Russian parliamentarian, gave a speech about civil rights, arguing that banning, forbidding, is the greatest freedom one can enjoy. And I quote her, "Prohibition is the greatest freedom of man." And you are always told that, look at the parliament, they are only prohibiting your rights. This is a lie, because prohibition is where a human being is free. One says this is not allowed, but you can do anything else as you please. The more rights you have, the less free you are. End of quote. I mean, this is full 1984, war is peace, right? I mean, no wonder after such blatant imperialist and dictatorial propaganda, Russian support for the war in Ukraine is complicated. This is what one of the recent polls in Russia says, and I'll quote, A majority of Russians would support ending hostilities and launching peace negotiations. According to the result of a September 2024 poll by Russia's Levada Center 1 on Russian views on the war against Ukraine, however, when asked if Russia should make concessions in such negotiations, a vast majority answered in the negative. Moreover, when asked to evaluate the conditions of a hypothetical peace deal, the vast majority of respondents rejected returning territories to Kiev, as well as Ukraine's membership in NATO. So they want peace because they're a little bit tired of the war, but in no universe they want to give land back to Ukraine, a country that they stole it from. So they want peace and they want to remain imperialistic. This basically means a large portion of the Russian population supports 18th century imperialist foreign policy. But the most insane thing is that in the first weeks of the invasion, the Russian government officially banned journalists from using the word war, calling the war in Ukraine a war or an invasion. It's forbidden in Russia. You will go to jail if you do that. Putin has signed a law that makes it illegal to share what the government calls false information about the armed forces. It's called something like discrediting the Russian armed forces. That's like what the law is called. Journalists could face up to 15 years in a prison for this, and some journalists have been put to prison for this. This is so crazy. Russian officials deny that their actions in Ukraine should be called a war or an invasion. As a result, several Western news outlets have stopped reporting from Russia to ensure their employees' safety, because, their employees are working in Russia in these filials or like these branches of the Western media companies, and they can go to prison in Russia for 15 years if they say war. In 2022 alone, Russia detained at least 20,467 people for political reasons, according to statistics by mr.innovations.info, a key human rights group in Russia. Of these, at least 19,478 were arrested for speaking out against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So 19,000 people in Russia didn't agree on Russian invasion to Ukraine and were brave enough to show it, and boom, they got a paragraph for that. Some of them in prison right now. Speaking of imperialism, it is frustrating that many people in the West don't see that Russia has gone full imperialist mode. From top to bottom, the public and ruling elites are in support of imperial ambitions. And the most dangerous part here is that many experts in the West don't see this. On the contrary, they continue to argue that Putin is not imperialist and that he is some sort of a pragmatic leader. And you know what pisses me off the most? Well, the fact that some people say that he has this grand master plan in his back pocket and he has yet to reveal it. One of the most prominent scholars of the international relations, John Mearsheimer, denies that Putin is an imperialist. He said this on the Lex Friedman podcast, and now I quote, "Well, clearly, the conventional wisdom is that Putin is principally responsible. Putin is an imperialist, he's an expansionist, and the idea is that he is bent on creating a greater Russia, and even more so, he's interested in dominating Eastern Europe, if not all of Europe, and that Ukraine was the first stop on the train line. And what he wanted to do was to conquer all of Ukraine, incorporate into a greater Russia, and then he would move on to conquer other countries." This is the conventional wisdom. And then the guy says this on Lex Friedman podcast. "My view is there is no evidence," let me emphasize, zero evidence to support that argument. End of quote. I think all there is evidence. Anywhere you look, you find evidence on that. In general, there are three main misconceptions that, to this day, shape the West perception of Russia. First, the West often misreads or underestimates how Russia thinks and acts. This leads to poor communication with Moscow. Experts and decision makers tend to apply Western ideas about politics and strategy to Russia. They assume things from the Cold War still apply to Vladimir Putin's government. They don't. Second, Western officials often ignore how Russia's political system affects its aggressive foreign policy. As long as Russia stays an authoritarian regime, the Kremlin will continue to use wars to gain support from its people. Wars are Russian leaders' way to consolidate people to support them. Third, the West's worry about political instability in Russia makes it value the current system's stability more than the chance for real political change, even though such change could make Russia less hostile towards its neighbors. In shorter words, the West is afraid to break the status quo. They're afraid of what might become after Russia on Russian territory. The violence, the power struggle, they are afraid of breaking Russia apart. Peace negotiations in this case won't be like negotiations between the leaders of the democratic countries. But today we hear and expect Putin to sit down with Trump and Zelensky as if, for example, it is a meeting with the French president and the German chancellor. So we should not expect the same kind of negotiations. Also, it is vivid as daylight that Putin's popularity among the Russian people only gains when the country is in conflict. Look at this graph. It clearly shows that imperialist policies are very popular in Russia. See how the support dips during the pension reform and lockdown and immediately goes up after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Russian people want war. So one should have little hope that the Russian people will demand something different than what Putin wants, because they have been consuming this imperialistic narrative for the last 25 years. Speaking about the narrative about the war, not only has it not changed, but it is amplified. The Russian government has done an excellent job of creating an alternative reality inside Russia on the matter and of the war in Ukraine. To grasp what the narrative associated with the phrase special military operation means, it is vital to explore how it was formed and rationalized. Putin's rationale relies on three main ideas: demilitarization, denazification, and Russia's historical lens, which can be described as follows. Ukraine is viewed as a historical error, an artificial entity established on what Putin asserts as territories with historical ties to Russia. The collective West exerts control over Ukraine, utilizing it as a tool against Russia. Consequently, Russia claims the right to reclaim these historical areas to avert NATO's expansion eastward, which is depicted as an immediate threat to its security. In this framework, demilitarization and denazification are presented as necessary steps for Russian safety. The notion of historical lands appeals to a nostalgia for the Soviet era and reflects Russia's imperial aspirations. The funniest part about Russian propaganda about Zelensky, being a Nazi or being imperialistic, they also claim very regularly that Zelensky is a drug addict and a Nazi and a Satanist. But I gotta remind everybody, Zelensky is Jewish. So, you are a Ukrainian president. You're a Satanist, Nazi, a drug addict while being Jewish. How is that possible? So every day, average Russian citizens hear that Russia must push harder to destroy enemies. Recently, one of the propagandist TV shows on Channel 1, Oleg Tsaryov, a separatist official in eastern Ukraine, once again supported more active advancement of the Russian forces. He said, and I quote, "One recipe to end the war is to win. Then all will be well. This year we are advancing 5 times faster. We are doing great. But if we keep moving at this pace, it would take 3 years to take just Donetsk Oblast." End of quote. And I'm surprised how right it is. You see Russians are advancing on the front line, but the tempo, look, if you compare it to the vastness of Ukraine, it would take decades for them to occupy another oblast with this tempo. Nuclear weapons are the favorite talking point of Russian propaganda TV channels. But the problem is, it's not only TV shows that gloat about the Russians using nukes against the West. Even official forums like St. Petersburg Economic Forum are part of the war narrative. Not only politicians, but academics are spreading this nonsense idea. Sergei Garaganov, one of the most prominent Russian historians, casually mentioned nuclear strike while sitting next to Putin. He said, and I quote, We understand very well that moving up the ladder of nuclear escalation can save many lives, because it can bring our adversaries to their senses. Perhaps it's too early to resort to nuclear escalation, but we need to move in this direction. If we don't climb up the ladder of nuclear escalation, won't we anger the God Almighty? End of quote. So basically, one of the most prominent Russian historians is asking Putin, if we don't escalate a nuclear threat in the world, won't we anger God? That's what Russian thought leaders are asking in public forums from the president and from the Russian people. Ladies and gentlemen, that's a bingo. And this was the 200,679th time Russia threatened to nuke the world. Get used to it. Moreover, Putin himself is the largest propagator of this narrative. Just 6 months after he waged a full-scale war against Ukraine, Putin paid tribute to Tsar Peter the Great on the 350th anniversary of his birth. Putin drew a parallel between what he portrayed as the twin historic quests to win back Russian lands. He said, and now I quote, Peter the Great waged the Great Northern War for 21 years. It would seem that he was at war with Sweden and he had taken something from them. He did not take anything from them, he returned what was Russia's. End of quote. By the way, the Great Northern War, majority of it was fought on the Estonian soil, right here where I'm right now, like 100 clicks where I'm right now, the battles happened. It was a full expansionist war to occupy Estonian lands from Sweden, who also at the time occupied us. Everybody has occupied us. And here's the cherry on the top as he compares himself to Peter the Great. And now I quote him again, apparently it is also our lot to return what is Russia's and to strengthen the country. And if we proceed from the fact that these basic values form the basis of our existence, we will certainly succeed in solving the tasks that we face. End of quote. I don't know about Peter the Great, but Lord Farquaad maybe, from Shrek 1. But if you ask Mearsheimer, there is zero evidence that Putin is imperialist. Yeah, right. By the way, it's a bit funny. Putin likes to compare himself with Peter the Great because Peter the Great was one of the Russian land gatherers. He expanded Russian territory. Peter the Great was the tallest Russian leader, Russian Tsar. He was a massive man, really big. And one of the interesting facts is that he had a very small foot. So he had to use a cane to walk because he was like almost 2 meters tall, 6.5 inches in foot. And he had like 38 size, European size foot. So he was like walking like that. Putin, on the other hand, is very, very short. So if I see these comparisons, it's a little bit, if I visualize it in my mind, I always get the giggles. Putin himself prepared Russian society for the war against Ukraine. In July 2021, Putin published the article called On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. And here he creates a narrative that Ukraine is not a real state and basically should be part of Russia. He said, and I quote, Russia was robbed. I am becoming more and more convinced of this. Kiev simply does not need Donbass. Radicals and neo-Nazis were open and more insolent about their ambitions. They were indulged by both the official authorities and local oligarchs who robbed the people of Ukraine and kept their stolen money in Western banks, ready to sell their motherland for the sake of preserving their capital. End of quote. It's funny because a lot of issues where Russia advanced so fast in the south of Ukraine in 2022 was because there were more corrupt officials in the Ukrainian military in the south, which the Russian FSB used. They bribed these officials. So now Putin is saying that Ukraine has sold their land. Well, in the south of Ukraine, some Ukrainian officers did sell their land and were corrupt, but they sold it to Putin. Weird. So what is the main lesson? Russia is not like a Western country. It is an authoritarian regime that rules without any moral standards cherished in the West. The amount of unchallenged propaganda that the average Russians consume is beyond imagination. That's why any sort of dialogue between the West and Russia is destined to fail, because the sides live in a different worlds. The average Russian does not know what freedom is. And it is crucial to understand that the Russian public is not an ally. It is part of Russia as a country and will act as Kremlin commands. Therefore, the West needs to take a tough stance and bolster its security in all aspects, and stop hoping that Russia will transform from within. My friends, thank you for trusting your time with me. In this channel, we will look at geopolitical analysis connected to Ukraine, Russia, and the war through humor. To learn, we need humor. Learning and analysis and being at the forefront of information war doesn't have to be dull. It can be fun. This is what I offer on this channel. So if you like the channel, become a monthly member or buy me a coffee. Links in the description below. Subscribe to the channel. And until my next video, which will be every Monday and every Friday, stay cool, my friends, and bye-bye.